The following is intended for informational purposes only. It is intended to supplement classroom training and documentation. It should not be relied on as a replacement or substitute for classroom training with a live expert instructor. Welcome to Lesson 6, Recurring Sections and Group Lines. In this lesson, we will show how you can create and use repeating form lines. And there are two basic methods, either by creating a recurring section, or you can have one section and within that section recurring lines called group lines. And we will concentrate mainly on the second one, on group lines. As well as doing that, we will also add in a few more form rules. So by the end of this lesson, you will have an improved tax detail section with the deductions, which is where we'll have some recurring lines, and as well as form rules which created a withholding amount and to actually send in a payment with your tax form. Let us look at the form again. I'm going to create a new tax form because I've added some new functionality which I want to show you. Go to tax form, choose my form type, and you will see that in a moment that I've added some functionality in the tax details. But first of all, I fill out the other sections. And here in the tax details, you'll see that as well as having the salary and other information, and we saw previously that we calculated the tax amount, now we do not create the assessment directly off the calculated amount, but we have a final tax amount which is calculated by taking the calculated amount and then having deductions. As you will see, we can have multiple deductions, so I can go like this and create many of them, and this is because I'm using a different type of line on my form type, which we will look at in a moment. So the first thing is I'm going to actually fill out some information here. So this is what we did previously, and I'm going to leave this empty so that when I actually validate the form, the calculated tax amount will be calculated. And then I have a final tax amount, which is the calculated tax amount minus the tax deductions. If you have any deductions after calculating the tax, so I'm going to say there's some deductions of, I don't know, something like that, and I'll leave this blank, and hopefully this will be filled in after the system validates. Now, after that, I've also added in a line for withholding. Let's say that some of the tax has been paid up front by an employer for an employee on his salary monthly, let's say. Then obviously that should be deducted from the amount that he owes. So I'm going to put in here, let's say he already paid $1,000, and we'll see that once we actually go through the form and create the stages, and it goes to the posting step, it will create the withholding adjustment for the $1,000, and that's why there is a line here for withholding adjustment, which will be filled in at the end. And that standing amount, I hope, will be filled in based upon this information that I've added in. And let's say a person has included a payment into the form when sending in, let's say, a form. It's also added a check for what he thought was still owing to the tax authority. Let's say believes he still owes, I don't know, $500, so he sends a check in as well. So let's first of all save this information. As you'll see, information has now just been saved. Now I hit validate. And what has happened over here, it's ready for posting. This has been calculated, this amount has been calculated by the form rule that we saw using the rate schedule. And then what happens is that $950 has been deducted from this amount to get this final amount. And then the withholding has been set as 1,000. That's what the person added in. So therefore, the actually outstanding amount, the amount still owed is actually, it's a credit of $122. And happens to also actually put it in a payment here for $500. So once we post this, what you should find is that we will obviously be in credit for 122 plus the 500, in other words, for $620. However, you might find it not be exactly like that, because there could be some payments, some penalties and interest, because this payment has only come in now for $500. So for some time, there shouldn't be any penalty and interest, because the withholding was for 1,000, so therefore it was always in credit. So we'll see what happens. Let's post it now. Post this form and see if we can work out what we get. Well, we have a warning that this person that we're going to create doesn't have an address, which is true. We haven't added address information in. Let's have a look at the main page. Maybe we can understand what's going on. Well, this was we created a person, an account, a tax roll, and a filing period. This is the assessment. So if we actually go to this tax details, final tax amount corresponds to the assessment that was created. And then what happened was there was a withholding for €1,000 and also a payment. So as we said, we would expect it to be around 620 in credit, and that's actually true. That's exactly what we have. If we actually look at the logs, we can see that the form rules created the account, the tax roll, the obligation, and then an assessment was created, and then this was an adjustment created. This was a withholding for minus 1,000, for credit for 1,000, and then a payment came in today. Now the adjustment for the withholding was actually set to have a date of the initial period right at the beginning. In other words, if I click on my withholding adjustment, you'll see that the effective date is actually the end of the payment due date for this particular filing period. So therefore, this particular account was never actually in debit. There should therefore be no payment penalties and interest, and in fact there aren't any, and that's why it's in credit for 622 once the $500 of the payment came in. Okay, so now that we've shown you how that works, let me now turn to the form type and see what we added to the form rules and also to the sections and lines. So let's go to start with sections and lines. Go to the bottom, we'll see the sections. The personal details remain the same, there are no differences, but if I click on the tax details, you'll see below that I've added quite a few new lines. And the most interesting one is actually this particular one, which is a group line. And let's look at that. Let's look at this one, and the tax deduction. Let's look at these lines, because this is the first time that we're looking at a group line. So this is a line type of group line, and this is really the header for the group line, and you define really information like that is a group line, and also the label headers, and that's basically it. Now the important thing is that when you get to the tax deduction, which is the line within the deductions, that's when this is used as a standard line. But this is where this is the most important thing. The group line business name, as we know, is deductions. Most important thing here, though, the form line business name is just simply the name of the particular line. But here, the group line business name is deductions. In other words, it's associated with that group. And that's, as a result of it being associated with the group, then you can have multiple lines of this type of deduction. Now, besides the deductions, that we have final tax amount, which is, all of these are just simply using the monetary amounts. We have a withholding, which again is straightforward. But then we have something called a withholding adjustment. If I click on that one, this one is a place where we place the foreign key value of the adjustment once the withholding adjustment has been created, and that's why you will see that I'm using here my field definition. It uses a foreign key reference of an adjustment. It also actually set it such that the output is set to output, meaning that it's read only. So you will see when we look at the form rules that the form rule is responsible for filling in this adjustment into this particular section and line. And since it's done by a form rule, it's read-only, meaning we don't have the ability online to edit it. The other thing which is interesting is the I have a payment line. Payment line here is different, that I'm using a base form field within the actual table of the tax form table outside the CLOB data. It's placed into form payment amount, and the reason why I've placed it into there is because the form rule which creates the payment is going to look for that amount to be able to create the payment. Okay, in some of them you'll also see that I have actually, if you go back to the actual tax form, you'll see that I have numbers here, but I didn't actually put numbers for the lines within deductions, and then the withholding adjustment, since it's read-only, I didn't put a line number there. So therefore the numbers here display sequences the order in which they're filled, but the line numbers follow the actual, again, the numbers that you see on the screen. Let's now turn our attention to the form rules that I added. Let me go back to let's start with the validation which was added to these form rule group. The first two are the ones we had previously, and now we have another particular form rule, and this form rule uses the same conditional element validation, and it calculates basically the total amount, the final amount, which is defined as the reference x, is equal to the total amount minus the sum of all the deductions. And in order to do that, this type is set to use function and a sum function. So it sums up all the deductions so that when we actually make the calculation, It's this deduct minus this plus this. These are added together, and that's because I'm using a function sum over there. Now, the other thing which we've added here is that, as opposed to, if you remember, line 40, that I have to add in 44, and it makes sure, the validation made sure that the actual formula is correct. 40 plus 5 minus 1. In this case, when we calculated this amount, this was calculated, again, by this, take away this. I didn't add anything in here. And I let the system do it itself, and I had it auto-correct. I used this particular section over here, auto-correct information, and I basically said, even if x is not set to be a minus b and it failed, let it auto-correct, let it fill in automatically that value. And that's why that value was populated over there. No problem came out, no problem was actually reported because I left it blank. And similarly as well, the outstanding amount also uses that concept of the autocorrect in order to fill in that information automatically. So if we looked at the outstanding amount for Merle, we would say something very similar to the one we saw previously. We'll have also x equals a minus b, so that the outstanding amount is equal to the final tax amount minus the withholding. So final tax amount minus withholding got the value of minus 122. In other words, the employer paid too much tax for the employee throughout the year, and that's why there's a credit. And again, we use the autocorrect as well. So that's the form rules for the validation. If we go back now to the form type and we look at the rules again, if we go to the posting, we see that we've added on two new form rules here. One is to create the withholding adjustment, and one is to create the payment. So if I click on withholding adjustment, you will see that it has a few extra settings that you need to set. First of all, I need to define where on the form, which value do I use to create withholding adjustment. It says tax details withholding. It says basically this one, and that's the reason why an adjustment for 1,000 was created. It tells you the debit or the credit adjustment type. When I create the adjustment type, what type of adjustment type do I create? In both cases, I'm using an individual income tax withheld. Reverse sign, what does that mean? Well, that means that when I put down the withholding as 1,000, what actually is going to be created is a minus 1,000 because it's actually a credit. But within the form here, I'm not putting a minus 1,000. So I need the system. I need an indication somewhere that whatever I'm putting in here, the sign has to be reversed. So therefore, I have to use the reverse sign. Link adjustment means, do I link the adjustment that was created to an assessment? If you remember, this is the assessment which is created, and it's shown on the main screen over here. This is the assessment. Do I link the Do I link the adjustment, the withholding, to the assessment? And as you see over here, I've set it to be yes. Again, the meaning for that is if I actually click on the withholding, you will see that this is the financial transaction, and it's related to this group FT ID. And this group FT ID is the assessment. Okay, and you can see that on the assessment you have a related adjustment, which is the withholding, and that's because again I've set the assessment. Sorry, I've set the withholding to be linked to the assessment, financial transaction assessment adjustment. here I define what date do I give this particular adjustment. And here I've set, if you've already shown this, it's set to the payment due date. Basically, this payment for this withholding was paid in by the employer beginning of 2010 or every month within 2010. It's definitely been paid by the payment due date, and that's why, and I've defined here what date do I give it for its effective date. And then finally, I actually have a reference for where do I want to put the adjustment as a reference onto the actual form, and I've set it on tax details withholding adjustment, and that's the reason why when I go back to my tax form, we see in the tax details section that the actual withholding adjustment is set over here, because I've told it to set it based on the setting here, resulting adjustment form reference. So that's the form rule to create the withholding adjustment. More complicated than the assessment adjustment. Assessment adjustment basically is pretty straightforward, doesn't need much configuration on the form rule, but the withholding needs a little more configuration. And finally, we have a create payment form rule. And the create payment form rule just defines the tender type and what happens if there's excess credit, what obligation type do I use. So the you don't see anything here about where within the actual form do we pick out the payment amount, and the reason for that is, as I've explained before, on the section that I've defined here for payment included, I've set it to write it back to the base field on the tax form table, which is the payment field on the tax form, and that's where this form rule will pick up that payment information. In other words, again, just to be clear about that, where does the actual amount come from? How does this form rule know where to pick up the amount? Well, it's because I define the section, just repeating something I just showed you before, but just now more in context. When we went down to payment included, it's the fact that I was setting over here related form field to be the form payment amount, so that when the data is actually held and saved onto the form, it's automatically copied, mapped directly onto this field, which allows me to update that field, and therefore the payment will be taken from that field without any problems. So that explains why we have how this works, how we've added in the withholding, how we added the payment, how we added in this multiple section. One of the things that I didn't show you though was that as well as having a multiple group line, you can also have a section which is duplicated, and you could then have multiple sections of the same type. That's something which we haven't seen, but that's something which you can look at yourselves if you actually create a section with multiple recurring. So what have we learned in this lesson? We have looked at recurring sections and group lines, and concentrated mainly on group lines. We've seen that in order to create a group line, you have to use a different underlying BO, the group line business object. And in order to associate a line with a group, the important setting on the line is the group line business name. And that's what is needed in order to add a line to a group. Many base form rules do not use group lines, and you'll see that if you start using group lines, then certain functionality will become unavailable for you. For example, you cannot set an underlining related form field if you're going to be using group lines, and the reason is because you won't therefore have a unique line to associate with that related form field, so therefore you will see that that will not be allowed. And also as a result, since many of our form rules, base ones, deal with the related form fields, they will not work if you start using group lines. So that's important to be aware of as you you look at these group line form rules.